Hello, we had some really nice calm weather this weekend, so I did an efficiency comparison between these two planes. That's obviously the Mini Talon on the left, and the one on the right I'll be calling my plane because I can't really think of a better name for it. And the main objective of this test was to compare the cruise efficiency, and I was trying to think of a few ways to do this, but I discovered a setting on the OSD in ArduPilot. This is the third from the top in the screen that we're looking at the moment. And this shows you the current per ground speed. So it's, I think it's how many milliamp hours of battery would be required to travel 1 kilometer horizontally. And you can, of course, test this on a windy day, but it means that if you want to average out the downwind and the upwind ground speeds, you have to go exactly 180 degrees to the other way to average them out. So it's just a little bit easier to do on a calm day when the difference between the upwind and downwind ground speeds is not so much. So in order to use this number correctly, you need to calibrate the current sensor on your planes. So I did that with both of these, and I calibrated it so that they matched the multimeter as best as I could get it at about 4 amps, 4.5 amps, because I figured that was somewhere around the lowest current that each of these planes would be able to fly at a sustained altitude. So cruise efficiency at the lowest throttle that could sustain altitude and level flight was one of my checks that I did. Another one that I did was the speed and efficiency at 8 amps. So both of these planes I figured could fly at about 5 amps. That would be the lowest setting. And then 8 amps would be when you want to get somewhere, somewhere a little bit quicker. I also tested the stall speed, and I was planning on testing the loiter efficiency. So it's quite handy in return to launch if you just put it in a circle above you. That's a good way to average out the wind in all directions because it's just going around and around. Unfortunately, I didn't get to do that on the Mini Talon because I got distracted with skimming over the trees and ran out of battery. Speaking of battery, the battery that I'm using here is not really the greatest. You can see that first cell is something a bit strange going on there. So I didn't really want to press it too hard with any full throttle runs or like fly too long and let the cells get down in case there is a nasty surprise. But it turns out that as long as you don't let the current draw get too high, it's actually okay. Here are the stats for these two planes. So you can see that mine is slightly larger in wingspan and heavier, and also this photo shows us looking approximately straight down on the top of the planes, and we can see that the wing area of my plane is a little bit larger as well. Now these relative weight numbers I've set to 1 for my plane, and then the numbers for the Mini Talon are whatever fraction of my plane's value that the Mini Talon has. So it's 85% of the weight and 75% of the wing area, so that translates to a 13% higher wing loading. Hope that makes sense. By the way, the way that I calculated the relative wing area was by colouring in, just roughly, the number of pixels in this photo. That's why I took it looking straight down. I've included a little bit of the fuselage in each case. I'm not really sure what you're supposed to do, but anyway, that's how I figured out the relative wing area. Man, I tell you, it took forever to count those pixels. So here's my plane attempting to sustained altitude cruise at 3.7 amps, and as you can see, it's not really working out. So I'm sort of slowly bumping the throttle up and up a little bit. And to cut to the chase, I couldn't really state that it would work until about 5 to 5.5 amps. And it's a little bit tricky to be exact on this because I think the hills all around the place are sort of messing up the air currents a bit. So in some locations I could cruise at 5 amps sustaining altitude, and sometimes it needed to be more like 5.5. Okay, so here's my plane in a sustained altitude cruise at 5.3 amps. Well, it's actually climbing slowly, so it could be slightly less than 5.3 amps, I think. But notice a couple of things here. The speed is quite slow, 48, 50 kilometers an hour or so, and the efficiency is hovering around about 110 milliamp hours per kilometer. Now here's the Mini Talon doing the same thing, and you'll see that at about 5.5 amps it's not quite able to sustain altitude, and if you keep watching the altitude it doesn't flatten out until the current gets up to about 6 amps, at which point it stabilizes. But more importantly, look at the speed and the efficiency. It's traveling much faster than my plane was, and so the efficiency overall is quite a bit better. 90. Here's my plane at 8 amps, efficiency is now at about 120 and the speed is around 67, 66. But note that it is actually climbing fairly steadily here. And here's the Mini Talon at 8 amps. Once again it's faster and more efficient, and it is actually also climbing a little bit here as well. Here's my plane doing a stall test. I just pulled full back on the elevator and gradually reduced the throttle. Now I'm in fly-by-wire A, that's auto level mode, so in hindsight that's not a very good way to do it because the autopilot's going to constantly be trying to level the wings, so you don't really get to see it do a tip stall properly like you would if it was in manual mode and you weren't correcting it. But it does sort of give you an idea of what the pitch would do, and it doesn't really do much. The stall speed seems to be around 30 kilometers per hour. Here's the same thing in the Mini Talon. Unfortunately, I think it's a little bit nose heavy because it didn't really stall, it just sort of slowed and then it started bobbing the nose up and down. I'm not sure if that's the flight controller doing that or what. Here's another attempt that worked much better. In fact, the flight controller was not even able to keep the roll steady for this one. And the stall speed is, again, 30 kilometers per hour by the looks of it. Here's my plane crawling past very slowly at what must be right on the edge of a stall. My plane was a fair bit more controllable in this situation than Mini Talon. Here's my plane inadvertently catching a bit of lift, I think. Notice that the throttle turns off when the timer says 20 minutes and 40 seconds and the altitude is 117 meters. And then I'll speed this next bit up. Over the next 1 minute, it only descends 17 meters per minute. So there must have been some sort of lift there, and I was just sort of circling around, waiting for it to get to 100 meters altitude so that I can turn the return to launch on and give it a level flight for the return to launch. And on the return trip, the autopilot settled on about 6 amps. And here's my plane doing a 100 meter radius loiter. Seems like the average current is about 7 amps or so. Now, as I said, I did not do a return to launch loiter test with the Mini Talon because I was doing this instead. So, what to tell at the end, hey? Well, it seems pretty clear that these two planes are very much in the same category, very close in just about every metric. But almost at every turn, the Mini Talon is just pipping my plane at the post, as the saying goes. And it's a little bit more efficient, a little bit faster, at least at this roughly 2 kilogram all-up weight. It's a little bit harder to launch than mine. My plane's a little bit easier to launch and easier to land as well, and that's probably just because of the wing loading being a little bit lighter. And my plane, I think I can say without any doubt that I could thermal my plane, no problem. I don't think I could quite say that for the Mini Talon. So that's all just differences of wing loading mainly. The Mini Talon at this 1700 gram weight is probably pushing the upper limits of its comfortable wing loading, I think, but my plane being a little bit larger could handle a fair bit more and still fly comfortably. In fact, I think most people fly the Mini Talon with about a 4S 5 amp hour battery, so you would see even better stats than what I'm seeing here because I'm using a 4S 8 amp hour battery, which I read somewhere that the person was writing this in the forums, they consider that to be rather porky, which it may well be actually, but it seems to be just right for my plane. My plane seems a little bit more stable in roll, and that could be just due to maybe a bit more wingspan or a bit more, a bit better tune in the autopilot perhaps, because keep in mind all this flying I've done here was in fly-by-wire A, so I'm using RG-Pilot to control the pitch and the roll most of the time. The Mini Talon seems to be a little bit harder to stall than my plane, but when it does stall, it can be less forgiving. So that's about it, really. All of this flying was done with an 8 amp hour 4S multi-star battery. That gave me a total of 40 minutes flying, roughly 20 minutes with each plane, and it was down to half charge, so that's 3.8 volts per cell. That's about all I have to say on this. I'll make another one of these stacked slices kind of planes, I think, and see if I can't beat this damn Mini Talon at his own game. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.